Hello and welcome to Must Read Fiction, a place for people who know that life is better with a novel in hand. I'm Erin Popelka, and I'm so delighted to be here today with author Devin Murphy. Welcome back to Must Read Fiction.
Hi, Erin. Hello.
So good to have you back on. So, a little bit about Devin Murphy. He has a PhD from the University of Nebraska at Lincoln and a Master's of Fine Arts from Colorado State. He teaches creative writing at Bradley University. His first book is The Boat Runner, which I have here in my hands. And his second book, which just came out this March 2019, is right here, Tiny Americans. So, Devin, I am so excited to talk to you about these books. So, let's start with Tiny Americans, this brand new book, hot off the presses. Please tell me about the book.
Sure. Well, hello again, and thanks. So, Tiny Americans is a book about a family that I check in on them over 30 years. There's a mother and father, and then the three kids. And over 30 years, I really wanted to sort of put a mosaic of a family together so that everybody had a piece of the picture. Because, you know, we understand our family from our own point of view, but I wanted to understand it from everybody's to get kind of a larger perspective. And I think that probably happened with me looking at the feeling of what it was like to be in a family and sort of not have the whole picture and sort of know you don't have the whole picture. Being sort of outside of your family when you grow up and you go out in the world by yourself, and then later in life, starting my own family. So those are three really big phases of my life, and I kind of wanted to address all three of those because that shift in perspective taught me a lot about myself and my family. So over the years of writing, I started locked in on the Thurber family, which this novel's about. And I just got fascinated with the characters, and I wanted to give them all a say to sort of see where the fractures and where the kind of stronger healing joints were within their family unit.
Yeah, and I love you use the word mosaic, which I think is such a beautiful way to describe this book because it's told in almost these little snippets, these little snapshots kind of along this pretty vast amount of time. Can you speak more to like how it was to write those little pieces of the mosaic?
Well, so I wrote a lot more of that, and what I did is I started realizing, well, what are just the sort of moments where each of these characters are having either large or small trajectory changing feelings. Like, am I gonna process this at the moment and change the way I act, or am I gonna look back on this moment and it's gonna kind of be something that I realize has kind of changed the way I act in life? And so I ended up writing all of their lives in a lot of different patterns, and then eventually I went back and looked at what was really essential is those moments where they kind of feel about each other and how that makes them feel about themselves. And so then it became sort of a mosaic. And it's interesting you cued in on that word. I'm just having this memory right now of being a kid on a field trip and seeing a mosaic in a museum, and I didn't really know that word, and it was the tiles and how close you are to it. You can see all the grout and the intricacy of the tile patterns, but as you move back, the perspective changes. And so I guess I was really interested in doing that on a subconscious level, and that's sort of what I tried to do, is let the pieces stand alone and be really interesting and beautiful, but let them the sum of their parts be more than what they are individually.
Oh, fantastic. And what an interesting story to sort of like thinking about that first mosaic you saw and how that perspective changes. And certainly over the course of a book, you have that too, whereas you really zoom back out and look at the book over the course of those 30 years, you're getting that full big picture, but in the moment, it is that crux of the moment. So interesting. And so one of the things you also mentioned that I'm really curious about is as a person in life, you know, we all have these big moments, right? Certainly wedding days, graduations, big job acceptances, things like that. But what you said was actually really interesting because you were more interested in these big turning points with the relationships. So can you tell me a little bit more about like how you teased out what those moments would be?
Sure. I mean, first you have to recognize them as a person, which maybe I'm slow on the uptake for. But what's been really phenomenal, I think we mentioned this last time we talked, is I'm now a dad of three young kids, and I keep having to deal with their in the moment crisis. But then I'm also realizing, well, this is exactly what I did, or their patterns are exactly what I have done or felt, and that's making me think, oh, how did my parents do that? You know, how did they get through that? And so I'm all of a sudden a lot more capable of being in my parents' shoes and looking at my wife's parents and the decisions they had to make and empathizing with way more of the reality of day-to-day stresses and reality of sort of the complexity of everyone's situation in life. And so that's more interesting to me than like the big wedding event. The pictures we put up that are just are all pretty. So I'll put a picture on Facebook of my cute little toddler, right? But I've got, for every one of those, I've got 40 of him screaming and full of rage and covered in snot trying to attack me, So it's just like, those seem a little more real and authentic to me. So I think I tried to, instead of showing you the facade of this is when things are great, I wanted to show the reality of what life was like for these people. And it was actually a little taxing because I had to kind of go inside myself and ask those questions and make those decisions and sort of live through those moments. And this was a kind of, in a weird way, a really personal book to write for that way. And it left me a little drained. So I'm excited it's out there, but I'm also a little exhausted. I think I don't know how to remove myself from my writing very well. So it's a taxing process.
Sure. Well, thank you for being brave and getting into some of those messy spaces. I think certainly that is one of the hard things about social media right now, is where we do always post like the highlight reel, like things that are really good and life is perfect, and life is not perfect. And sometimes things aren't really good. And so thank you for being vulnerable in your writing and getting into some of those really messy, tough spaces.
Sure. You must know this with what you're doing. This must-read fiction is, for me, I would read a novel, and even if it was a dark novel, I would feel more connected to humanity at large, and say, well, if this is the range of feelings a human's capable of having, well, I'm capable of having all that too. And so I felt like a measure of kinship in reading that sort of stuff, where I do not feel when I see like all the glossy, beautiful stuff on social media. It's like nice to keep in touch with people, but that novel is like the under the skin reality of people that I find much more interesting.
Beautiful. Just kind of connecting us to our really fundamental humanity in both those high moments and those really low moments too. Thank you. Thank you for being brave with that. And so speaking of some, kind of low moments in the trajectory of humanity, your first book, The Boat Runner, looks at World War II Europe, which is, of course, a dark chapter. And Tiny Americans, as you mentioned, is sort of a little bit more modern, kind of set in the late 70s, through the next 3 decades, as you mentioned. And so those are really different times and really different settings, Europe and the US, World War II times versus a little bit more current, a little bit more modern. Talk to me about exploring those times and those settings and how it felt different to write the different books.
Well, it's interesting you're saying that. A lot of people are kind of thinking, well, how did this person write these two diametrically opposed books? And I was having to talk to my agent and editor about what's coming next. And I said, I think I might be a real pain in your butt, because these books are so hard, as I mentioned, and they take me so long that by the time I'm done with it, I have all these other ideas percolating. And I'm probably attracted to those other ideas because they're so different than what I've been doing.
Sure.
And so with the World War II book, I had to go teach myself everything about World War II, which took years. So I really had to become a researcher and sort of a scholar. And also at that time, that was my first book, so I was really trying to figure out how to write fiction in a novel. With this book, it was a little more personal because it was more contemporary. So the characters had to be a little stronger opposed to that historical background. And I did have to pay really close attention to where I wanted to focus on each character and how the spaces between jumping from one to the next actually built tension between each section. So structurally, it was a little more challenging to write. Emotionally, it was probably a little more challenging because with The Boat Runner, it was emotionally hard because I didn't know if I was ever going to publish it. I didn't know if I was ever going to do it. It was really, you have to live with doubt for years and years. And with this book, I knew I could do it because I'd had The Boat Runner. I just didn't know, like you talked about being brave and vulnerable. I didn't know how much so I had to go down that, how deep I had to go down that hole. And so that was challenging. And so in that way, they're a bit different, but they taught me a lot about structuring a novel, how to put a novel together. And going forward, I can see my next projects as definitely being different. And my editor said, well, they'll be different, kind of almost genre, almost context, almost history, but the writing will be identifiable to me, which I hope to be the case, because I do really, I like my writing style right now. I like what I'm doing, and I hope to keep that, like the through line between whatever era or time I jump into.
Absolutely. And I will certainly give a huge, also big 2 thumbs up. Your writing is beautiful. Like, must readers, please do pick up a copy of one of these books. If nothing for like the quality of the sentences and the quality of the descriptions. Like, Devin, you have just a really great eye for detail and for seeing some of the nuance in the world that we live in. So thank you for taking your keen eye for detail and sharing that with us through your writing.
Thank you. That's more a labor of effort, you know, because once I read a book I love, it sets that bar so much higher for me as a writer. And so I have to go back. I might have the story, but I have to go back to the sentences, to the scenes, to the imagery. And when I'm kind of done with the story, I'll read a lot of poetry, just because it has to make use of short space, and has to make language burn. And so once I kind of have the story, I'll start trying to think about the language on that level, and then I'll go back and try to make that story even rise up to the level of the books that really affect me deeply.
Oh, beautiful. Make the language burn. I mean, if there's nothing we walk away with, you even speak in poetry. I love it. That's so
I
great.
probably stole that from some poem.
I mean, it's just embedded in your brain now, but I love it. So making the language burn, Devin Murphy, so great. Another question, and this is just sort of a through line I noticed in both of these books. So both The Boat Runner and Tiny Americans do have this element of children watching their parents and watching their parents' relationships, particularly in like some pretty tough moments. And so earlier you talked about being a parent and thinking about looking, at the world as a parent and with your children, but can you speak a little bit more to the other side of that? And certainly one of the things that seems to come through in these books, which is children watching their parents.
Yeah, I feel like I should lay down on the therapist couch for this one. I think maybe that's just a theme I'm dealing with, because I think as a writer, you want to have that same sense of wonder and confusion that you do naturally as a child. Everything's really cool and neat, but I don't really know what the hell's going on, and so I'm going to just explore and figure it out. And so if you grow up in a house with two parents, I mean, it's a relationship, and relationships ebb and flow. And so I think I was very tuned into that of my parents, and therefore other people. And so maybe that's just something naturally I paid attention to in my writing. And so when I started writing and it wasn't going well for me, I think I wasn't tuned into how relationships work with people on the page. And so once I started realizing that I need to work on that, to make that as real and complex and confusing as I found other people's relationships, especially my own parents, then my writing really started getting stronger, and I started taking that idea of reciprocity of character over one character. If this character is really well done, it will make this character better, and vice versa. And so, if you're going to write a genre fiction with a good guy, bad guy, write the bad guy first, make that bad guy really appealing so everyone else. And so it's no different in any sort of minute relationship too. And so I think I really try to focus on that in my writing. And maybe that's because subconsciously I do that as a person as well. Maybe I dwell in the past and try to make sense of things that didn't make sense to me at the time.
Interesting. So interesting. Well, thank you for laying down on the therapist couch with me on that one. I didn't mean for that to feel like such a personal question. But it does require that.
Off screen real quick.
Right. It does require that same level of bravery though, right? As we're sort of looking, because there's a vulnerability in the listening and there's a vulnerability in the watching too, right? And so certainly that comes through in both of your works as well.
That's good. Yeah, and I'm a creative writing teacher too, and it's fun because I get these students who don't really know that they have a lot to say yet, and I can just clue them into who they are and their own kind of radar and what things they've perceived and what they're holding on to. And before you know it, they're speaking in their own unique voices about things that they have imprinted on themselves that are fascinating. And so it's just like these little molds of clay coming in. You just got to teach them how to play with what they already have. And so it's maybe it's because I teach that. I tend to find it easier to do myself these days.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. Thank you for journeying there for us. And so, kind of as we round out our interview, so The Boat Runner came out not quite 2 years ago. And I would just love to sort of hear if you have any stories about bringing The Boat Runner into the world, or any moments with readers or insights from readers. Like, are there some good moments from The Boat Runner's entrance into the world?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I had readers was pretty great. The fact that it did well enough to let me keep writing was, best case scenario. And it's funny. It's a book I spent 10 years really pouring myself into, and now that it's out there, to have people talk to me about it. And so at readings, people come up and they'll tell me their connections to the Netherlands or World War II, and part of me is thinking, well, this is amazing. Everyone's got these great stories. The other part of me is thinking, I wish you had told me this before I wrote the book. You know, this would have really helped me in my research. And then there's funny, kooky stuff. Like I'll get a letter from Maritime Canada. I really liked your book, but the measurement of the ship you used on page so-and-so is 3 feet short. I'm like, well, okay, I got a couple 100,000 details right, and I got a few wrong. So, but that kind of thing is funny. The fact that a book has a life of its own I haven't experienced that before. So that's been a real joy. And the fact that I did it was really cool. But now that it's a couple years removed and it's still kind of doing its thing is just amazing to me. And I'm just thrilled about it.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you for bringing it into the world so that we can keep talking to you about it. And so tell me, and then we'll kind of round out with this beautiful book, Tiny Americans. So how are you going to be bringing Tiny Americans into the world?
Well, so last Tuesday in Chicago, I had the book launch. So it was a week ago, and it was pretty fun. My sister from Charlotte, my sister from Maine flew in to surprise me. My wife had arranged that, so I didn't know they were coming. And so we had a big book launch in downtown Chicago, which was a blast. And one of my sisters have not seen me do a book talk before. And you know, I'm her little brother, but I'm also like, no, professor. I do this all the time. So she was like, who is this guy? So that was fun. And let's see, then I'm gonna hit the road. I'm gonna go to Portland, Oregon, Texas, Michigan, Colorado coming up soon, Chicago. And so I get to go travel around a little bit with, you know, with my schedule. I'll kind of go to a place and come home because I got small kids. And so my wife and I kind of balance the schedule a little bit. But so, yeah, I get to go out and start talking about the book a little and kind of purge it from my system. And then I can get back to some new projects. So I'm pretty excited. It's a great time.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Well, congratulations on the release of Tiny Americans and the success of The Boat Runner. Must readers, please do check out Tiny Americans, The Boat Runner by Devin Murphy. And Devin, thank you so very much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you for being so joyful about this and energetic, and it's fun to talk to as always. So hopefully you can keep doing this, and next time we'll talk about your book.
Yeah, sounds great. Till the next one. Thank you.
That's great. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Erin. Bye, everybody.
Bye.